Well, we have several too, but it's just that this was,
Yeah, it's always,
poignant.
I found for some people, it's, they find it very comforting, and other people find it kind of disturbing to celebrate All Saints. Because
I don't know,
it just depends on whether it reminds you of your joy or it reminds you of your grief. For most of us, it's a combination of both.
It is a combination.
Yeah, so it's not uncommon to see tears in people's eyes on All Saints Sunday, but also smiles as they remember the blessing that that person was in their life. So
I am so grateful to be a Christian. I swear, I mean, that whole idea of, I have several friends who are Jewish, and, well, the one, she lost her husband, it was like, okay, he's gone, that's it.
Yep.
I mean, other Jews believe in it, but she apparently didn't, and, you know, what do you say? How do you comfort someone like that? So, the other neighbor, he actually came to Jen's funeral, and he was in awe of the whole shebang. Yeah, he is.
It's probably got a very different spirit
Yeah.
than at a.
Well, he's the one that does believe in an afterlife. In fact, he said the most interesting thing, he said heaven was determined as how close you could get to God when you got there. So it's like, I guess it's your belief system, you know, and so you're more blessed if you're closer to God after you pass away. So I don't know, I'm not sure how I understood that, but it was interesting to hear what he had to say.
Yeah, well, our
Sounds
epistle
a lot
lesson
like
has
righteousness.
a radically different perspective on where we are in the presence of God. It makes me think of Bob and Dorothy. What was their last name? When I was here.
Milk? No?
No.
Or the,
Oh, I can picture him too. And I remember her telling me, Bob had cancer and he went through about 2 years of treatment and eventually passed away. And as he was going through the dying process, he had the sure and certain hope. And it was always there, but I remember she came to me about a year after he died and said to me, Pastor, I don't know how to help my neighbor, because it was somebody of a Jewish background, had just been diagnosed with cancer, and was part of the Jewish whatever tradition that there is no life after death. And she said she is just destroyed.
yeah.
Because her life is coming to an end, and she said it's such a contrast to what I walked through with my husband, and the hope and confidence that he had, and the willingness then that when the time came to accept that, to make sure that he had, spoken to everybody he wanted to speak to, and but he just had this confidence, and she said, boy, it's really standing in stark contrast now, and I don't know what to say to help her. So not having that hope,
It's heartbreaking.
that's heartbreaking.
But then again, I have joy. I might not be happy about it, but like I told you before, I have joy in my heart because I know the Lord is there for him and for me.
And that's why what I did with this particular Sunday is tied it back to our original theme, which is built up to build up. Because one of the things that God does is builds up for us a permanent home. And that's reflected in the Psalm where it uses that concept of building. So let's start with Psalm 127. Let's read it responsively as it's printed. Unless the Lord builds the house, the builders labor in vain.
Unless the Lord watches over the city, the guards stand watch in vain.
In vain you rise early and stay up late, toiling for food to eat.
For he grants sleep to those he loves.
Children are a heritage from the Lord, offspring a reward from him.
Like arrows in the hands of a warrior are children born in one's youth.
Blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them.
They will not be put to shame when they contend with their opponents in court.
Yeah, in some of the translations, it's literally it's enemies at the gate, but that's sometimes where the court proceedings happen. So the first question is just, have you ever been called a workaholic, someone who rises early and stays up late, consumed by
Never.
busyness?
Oh, I don't know. My daughter would think I was a workaholic just because as an instructor or teacher, you always bring stuff home and do it.
Mm-hmm.
But I never considered myself to the point where it would, impede on my, well, it did when I went back for classes to, get degrees, but when I could, I spent time with family, so. But I wouldn't call myself a workaholic in that regard. I don't know, I didn't see it that way.
It could vary day by day. One day when you're infused with enthusiasm and you've got that long list and you plow into it and you keep going and going, and the satisfactions of the progression are just, wonderful and so on. And on a day like that, I would hear Jean saying, "Sharon, come to bed." And I'd be downstairs late in the evening, late at night, cracking hickory nuts, or something.
And that's a labor-intensive.
Yeah, we had a system.
Yeah.
He had a little scout voice and vice that he put on a piece of wood that I could hold on my lap. And this is no banging with anything, this is just a gradual tightening.
Until
And
it
it
cracks.
slips it.
Oh.
And if you have soaked the nuts and then allow them to dry a little bit, and you can pick out perfect halves. I don't do that anymore.
I should have known you a long time ago, because back in my first congregation, there were a lot of hickory nuts in that area, and I'd have people who would bring me a bag of hickory nuts.
Oh, to me, I think they're
But-
just wonderful.
But I didn't know whether it was a blessing or a curse, because sitting with a hammer and
Oh, yeah.
hammering them open
Yeah.
and trying to pick out the meat and
That's
stuff.
no fun at all.
No.
That's a curse.
But we had people who, I had the ladies in the congregation who would bring a hickory nut pie once in a while, just good stuff.
Mhm.
But, yeah, in vain you rise up early and stay up late. And I think all of us are kind of a product of our environment. I know my dad always had, when he was especially teaching high school, had like 3 jobs. Now, he still coached our baseball team somehow, but because teaching in a Lutheran high school didn't pay very well, so.
I keep forgetting that I had him in class, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, he was good. He's a good teacher. I
Yeah,
liked him a lot.
and and once he was able to go into the extension office after he finished teaching, well, then he only had one job. That made all the difference in the world. But I will tell you that my wife has accused me of being a workaholic, and she's probably right. And always said, especially as the kids are growing up, you've only got a limited amount of time when you can. Now, the advantage of being a pastor is I was one of the few fathers at a 4 o'clock basketball game. Or when I did coach my boys in baseball, I could have a practice in the middle of the game, and I didn't have to argue about diamond time or the pitching machine or those kind of things, because nobody else wanted it at that time. And as long as the kids could get there, So the flexibility of the hours was helpful, but still, if you're in a job where you don't punch in and punch out, but where you have stuff to do,
Yeah, like me.
like teachers,
You're always working. And I just never, maybe my kids would have thought I was a workaholic, I don't know. But the other thing too is if you're doing what you like, or you love,
yeah,
it's not a burden
right.
in a way. Like going back to school was a burden because, going back to.
It's just sometimes when it takes away from other priorities in your
Right,
life.
but then
Sometimes,
it's things like, my kids might call me workaholic now because of the garden. But it's what you like, it's
Yeah.
what I've been given to do now, and I'm happy with that.
Well, and that's part of I think the rest of this. I always think about it this way. I've tried to teach my children it's not about making a living, it's about making a life. And if the only reason you're working is to make a living and your life stinks, then maybe that's not the best use of your time. Sometimes a little less in terms of stuff can actually lead to a richer life, and being willing to settle and not have what maybe somebody else has, but have a little less, but enjoy what you have in a way that others can't. So yeah, that's definitely a part of this. And even if you do rise up early and stay up late, his point is if you don't have the Lord in your life, what's it for? What's it for? What does Solomon say is true of those who only rely on their own efforts? How does he describe? What are the words that he uses to describe their experience?
They labor in vain.
3 times that's in there, right? It's in verse 1. In the beginning, it's in verse 1, verse 2, twice in verse 1 and once in verse 2. It's useless. It doesn't have meaning. And to have work that has meaning is what he's pointing to here. Okay? What blessings come to the one who invites the Lord in as a construction manager of their lives? So how does he? That's the way I put it.
Peace, contentment.
Peace and contentment. Mm-hmm. The other thing we could say about those who don't have the Lord is, how do they look at their work? How is it described?
Toil.
Toil, and that's a word that means it's a burden, not a blessing. And that's always been my advice to people who have come in and said, Pastor, I just don't get any joy out of what I'm doing. I said, well, then find something else to do, because life's too short. It just is. And I think, as you said, when somebody finds that place where they can use their gifts and passions in a way that is a blessing to themselves and a blessing to others, that's kind of your sweet spot, and helping people to find that spot. You still got to eat, right?
Right. Sometimes you don't know that it's going to be a blessing, because I never wanted to teach. I taught for 40 years. But every time I looked at the room of opportunity, that was the only door that was ever open. I mean, I tried everything from illustration, kids illustration, key line and paste stuff. I've tried everything. And God would always, I was always in the wrong place at the wrong time. It wasn't that I couldn't do it, it's just that it wasn't time. And the only door he ever opened was education, and pushed me through. So then you just kind of say, okay, so apparently I need to do this well.
Right.
So my attitude was always, I'm an artist that's teaching my love of what I do, and that way it made it more palatable, and then I did learn to love it more because of the interaction with the students. But sometimes what you have to do is look at the job that you're given and say, okay, if this is feeding my family, how can I make it better?
Right.
If that's what's
Right.
going on. So.
And very often in occupations you have choice. If you're a nurse, there's all different kinds of nursing, right? You can be an ortho nurse, you can be a med-surg nurse, you can be an administrative nurse, you can be an ICU nurse. There's all different kinds of things, and each one requires a certain heart, and therapy. Who do you like working with? What age group, situation?
Yeah, makes a difference. And
Right,
who
so
do you work with?
some people are very comfortable with the elderly population, and that's what they're drawn to in terms of their career. Others would want to work with kids. Others have worked in the workplace, I know, in therapeutic kind of situations. Joanne, Pat's sister, her daughter Sarah, works for Harley and does physical therapy, because they have their own to deal with some of the, if somebody's doing the same repetitive work all the time, they can put stress on a certain part of their body, and I remember when she got hired, I'm like, Harley? As therapist? And yeah, well then when you think about it, it makes sense. And so it's not just having a skill or ability, but finding that sweet spot of where you serve, you know, and how you do that. So the idea that you have peace, you have meaning, and then it shifts to this image of children. I suppose because in their day and age, most households are going to have children. The way I was just finishing premarital with somebody, and the second last chapter is the sex chapter, and I said, you know, that's the funny thing, that your sexual organs are part of the reproductive system, which means if you have sex, you're probably going to have a kid unless you get something in the way. As long as your bodies are healthy and doing what they were designed to do, that's the way it works. And of course, it's only in modern, you know, in the last how many years that regular birth control has been available to women and men now. So I asked this question. He says, blessed is the man whose quiver is full of them. What would a quiver full of children look like in Solomon's day and age?
Lots. But then we've said before that not all of them would make it to being adults.
Right.
Yeah, weren't they sacrificing them?
In some cases.
Well, but even in the normal way of life, if somebody was a believer and didn't sacrifice their children, there were some who were worshiping, especially the god that's mentioned as Moloch in the Old Testament, and they did try to appease that god by child sacrifices. You know, and we forget how primitive, you know, many of those cultures are. I was reading something probably within the last 2 months about they discovered some cache of bones in the Aztec culture, one of those down in South America, and every one of them, there was evidence that they had been sacrificed, you know, and what a bloody business sometimes that is, that you think you can appease God by killing other people. But, but even if you're thinking about a normal everyday occurrence, before we have, and we forget that because we're so used to it, before we had modern medicine, what happened? Scarlet fever would come through. Kids would die. I had members in my first congregation whose tonsils were taken out on their kitchen table. You know, and if you think about it, back in the day when you didn't have modern hospitals, you didn't have, you know, when doctors did house calls, and you're talking about days when cars weren't real prevalent, and so maybe the doctor's got a horse and buggy and he's going around, he's got to do what he's got to do in that particular location. And I think I've said this before, in my first congregation at Emmanuel Borth, anybody who was in their 70s or 80s at that particular time, now that's 40 years ago, but anybody who was in their 70s and 80s, if I got to know their story, would find out that they either lost a brother, sister, mother, father, or a child sometime in their life when they were young. And many of them had children who died of various diseases or farm accidents. OSHA didn't exist then, right? So the equipment that they had and all of that kind of stuff, you're much more likely to have those kind of things happen. One of our best friends in that congregation, he was adopted into this family because the natural born son had died because he'd fallen under either a tractor or wagon wheel. And that was their only boy, so then they adopted this one when they were about 40 years old. Really, really nice, a real blessing to him and to his mom and dad. But yeah, Which meant that in that day and age, if a child, or in that time, if somebody had a death of a child, you had all of these people in the community who had already experienced it and could walk with that person in a way that very often parents don't have today, because it's the exception, not the rule. You know, there's I talk about this when I go on a baptism visit, because one of the things I hand out is something about making sure you get a will, right? That's just part of being a good parent, is that you need to have a will. Why? Not because you got a whole bunch of money to leave, but if something should happen to you, you want to have a voice at that table when they decide where to send the children. And the only way you can do that after death is through a will. So setting aside guardians and making sure they're aware of it, whatever means you have to fund a trust that would give them the capacity to be able to do that. But now the good thing is when you're having that conversation, you can say, as I often do, thankfully those wills never get put into effect. You know, most of those wills that are written, there's a reason we don't have orphanages anymore. But you know what, I've had people who either adopted children or were adopted from the Kinderheim, as it used to be called, Lutheran Children's Friends Society, then it became in English, and now it's a counseling agency, and they don't have an orphanage anymore, but the orphanage used to be on the place where Harwood Place is now. I think it was on that property, the Kinderheim, and they used to have lots of children there back in the early 1900s. So sometimes I think because in our lifetime we haven't experienced those same kind of tragedies, it's hard to identify with what's a quiver full. But normally what I say to people, how many generations do you have to go back before there are families with 10, 12 children?
Not very far.
Yeah, that'd be my grandparents.
My grandparents, yeah.
Had,
My mother.
yeah,
One of 9.
one of 9.
Would have been, there were 10 children.
Right.
The eldest, the only boy of a farm family, died of diphtheria at about 18 months. He was the firstborn. And, you know, so the girls helped out and did the work.
Yeah, and even when I think about, that, yeah, I only have to go back to grandparents, but even when I think about parents who have experienced deaths of children, my mother-in-law had 2 boys who didn't survive out of 5. Every other child died. So she had Jerry's older brother, then had one who was born. One of them only lived a couple of weeks, so one of them lived a couple of years, and Jerry always feels guilty about that a little bit, because apparently she had a disease that he caught or something like that. I don't know. But then the one after her died, and then came her sister. So she had 5 pregnancies, but only 3 children who survived. They were all born, but. And of course, even, I think about some of the things that I've seen at children's, it's part of the abortion debate right now. At what point do you protect a human life, even if you're not a believer that every life is a gift of God? At what point are you obligated to protect that life? And one of the challenges, I think, with the whole abortion debate right now and what's happened is that we've gotten wiser about what's going on in the womb, and the age of viability has gone back significantly. I've seen children who were born at 1.8 pounds survive and do fine. And you think, 1.8 pounds, how big is that?
Less than a steak.
Yeah. Yeah, it's incredible. And I had some triplets in the at Emmanuel, and they were all right about 2 pounds. Everyone's doing fine. You know, some had to do a little bit of therapy for, some cognitive or physical delays, but otherwise they're doing just fine. And how many years before that would they not have lived? Or once in a while, I've had people who have had either heart defects where they did cardiac surgery immediately when they were born, or a situation where their esophagus wasn't connected, which apparently happens more often than you'd think. But the surgeries to fix those things, are not all that old, where you wouldn't have been able to do anything about that. And they even do surgeries while the child is still in the womb.
Isn't that amazing?
It's incredible. So I think that's part of the challenge, is that we've moved that age of viability there. So what's a quiver full in Solomon's day and age? Well, probably, 10 or so, right? What's a quiver full now?
3 maybe if you're lucky.
3 if you're lucky?
Yeah. I think most people figure if they've got 2, then at least they've reproduced themselves.
Right.
But I don't know, I got 3, and like I said, after you, first of all, you get 2, it's not the same, because the first one, you figure, oh, this is fine, When you have 2, it quadruples the work. When you have 3, it becomes a circus. And then after that, it doesn't matter, however, I only have 3, but it doesn't matter after that, 4, 5, 6, they're all a circus after that. So, it doesn't matter, well,
Yep, we have 4.
Yeah, so after 3, it becomes a circus, right?
And I will tell you that most people would think 3 is a quiver full now, at least in my experience, because when Jerry got pregnant with Matt, our youngest, there were a lot of people who were like, really? Including some close family members who are like, you haven't figured out how not to have children yet? Like,
You're gonna wring these people's necks.
Yeah.
It's really up to you. It's your choice.
Jerry always said, I would, because of that reaction when we started telling people, she said, I'm going to kiss the first person who says congratulations. It was our doctor. And I remember she told him, by rights I should kiss you, but it probably isn't a good thing. Neither Dan nor your wife would appreciate it. And I knew him pretty well because I played basketball with him 3 mornings a week at the middle school gym. He was a great guy. And he's the first one who said to Jerry, well, congratulations. Of course, he also said she should continue having babies because she had relatively easy and healthy pregnancies and never was in the hospital more than 2 hours delivering a baby. So he said, you should just keep going. And she said, no, I think 4 is enough. But I have to tell you, my own experience, 1 was great, 2 really anticipated, 3 was pretty good, but when you hit that 4th one, they're like, what's wrong with you? And so quiverful is just different. How are one's children protectors and advocates as one ages? He says they will not be put to shame when they contend with their opponents in the court, but that is that you've got other people who have witnessed your life. So you've got character witnesses in court, but I think in our culture I see it so often in terms of what children do for their parents as they age, which is?
Care for them. My daughter, because she lived next door when my parents moved into our home, and I had my parents live with us, of course, for 20 years, and they moved there because I have a large yard, pie-shaped in front and it's huge back, and they're both gardeners, and assisted living would never have allowed them to garden the way they wanted to, so that's why they moved in. And after my mother had Alzheimer's the last 4 years of her life, and my dad had some issues, health issues, and my daughter said that I set a very good example as to how you negotiate all the problems that you have with growing old. But then again, she teased me and said, yeah, well, I'll put you in a nursing home. But no, she really said that, especially being in ICU and realizing that you have a lot of people who are on the verge of death for one reason or another, and to observe family
How
members,
families interact.
especially ones who haven't seen their loved ones forever. They're the ones that want to extend the life of the person, and that's not right. And those who are the closest to those people understand it's time to let go. And I think that makes a big difference. So those are the types of things she observed, and I think that makes a difference, the kind of example that you set, because then that's how your children are going to treat you or respect you or do what you
Well, it's like
want.
anything else when you're teaching your children, most of what you teach them is by example. It's what they see. You know, I talk about that with premarital couples. You know, when it comes to how do you fight fear? Well, what did you see your mom and dad do? And you can have very different experiences between two people as they've grown up into, you know. Something as simple as what is yelling? And what is raising your voice? Well, in one family it can be here, and in another family, no, you're not yelling until you get to this decibel level, you know, and it's just a difference. It's not a right or wrong, it's just a difference, but the perceptions by the people who are involved in it are different. So being an example about how you care for the aging.
Well, too, when you make decisions, our first year we were married, I think I looked to my mother for an example, he looked to his dad, and I'll tell you, his dad would never marry my mother, and my mother never would have tolerated his dad. So we had to look at each other and say, you know, this is our life, we have to make our own decisions and become our own person,
Right.
as opposed to trying to hold up two people that would never have gotten along together, and so we'll make up our own rules. But still, they had a certain amount of influence as far as right and wrong. But when it comes to actually dealing with one another, it depends upon the two making decisions.
Yeah.
And I say it's not a matter of yelling, it's a matter of whether your middle name gets used.
Oh,
Karen Marie Miller.
yeah.
When the middle name comes out, you know you're in trouble.
Yeah. You're right.
That's when it's.
Or using my full name. I always tell the doctors after, because my legal name is Marjorie, and I'd say, I'd rather you not call me that, because the only person who called me that was my mother when she was angry. So
it's got kind of negative connotations. When
well, yeah, because it
brings up other memories, trigger. Well, and Karen, certainly you've had the experience of caring for your mom. And it's just reminding us, you know, of what a precious privilege it is. I think about how often, you know, we sometimes go with one of our parents to an appointment so that we're hearing what they're hearing, and because even when you're young, it's good to have another set of ears sometimes, because of whatever you're going through emotionally, you don't always hear what the doctor, nurse, or therapist has to say. And
but
so
it's important for you to get that power of attorney, because the doctors won't talk to you otherwise.
Unless they are there and give you permission.
Right, but my mother had Alzheimer's, so
right.
I needed to show them.
And that's where the power of attorney is really, really helpful. And that power of attorney, I really like that for both medical and financial matters. The medical one is really, really critical, especially because somebody's got to make those decisions, and if for whatever reason that person is incapacitated, who has all the information to make that decision? I know a lot of people get pushed into or directed toward a living will, where they say, well, this is what I want you to do. The problem with that is that you're doing that without all the information of what is actually going to be going on there, what are the medical circumstances.
The context of what's going on.
Right. And that's where I think a medical power of attorney is a much better choice. Giving it to somebody that you trust is going to make the best decision for you, knows how you feel, but is going to make the best decision for you. I just think that's a much better way to go. And some people are hesitant to do that because they'll say something like this: I don't want to be a burden to my children. And I loved, it was an ethicist actually from Valparaiso, his name was Gil Mylander, and he wrote an article. Dick Iyer, who was a chaplain at Columbia, had pointed me to it, and he, the title of the article was "I Want to Be a Burden to My Children." And what he went into in the article was simply this, is he said, who do I want making decisions for me? I want people making decisions for me who love me, who know me. And he said, and this is the way I look at it, not being a burden really for my children, is Lord knows I made a lot of decisions for them as they were growing up, right? Were they hard sometimes? Yeah. Was I sometimes second guessing myself? Yeah. But I embraced the opportunity to make those decisions for my children because I loved them. And because I loved them, it wasn't so much a burden. It was a task, yes, but it was a joyful task as I embraced the opportunity that I had to love and care for that child and sometimes make decisions that they didn't necessarily always agree with, right? But I did it for their benefit. And so can I trust my children as I age in my relationship to do the same for me? Where they'll take on that task without saying it's a burden.
I think it's more of a burden if you don't have your finger in that pie, because you feel helpless. You feel helpless if you can't help them.
So in this Bible text, what kind of things were people going to court for? What is that reference to?
The court reference?
Yes.
Well, you remember that everything had to be affected in the, this is the way I understand it at least, is that you had witnesses. You had character witnesses, you had witnesses who were with you, because remember, everything in a court of law according to the Old Testament law had to be established by 2 or 3 witnesses. So convicting somebody of circumstantial evidence would never work. And so having people who are, and realizing that these lives, this is maybe where it isn't quite such a parallel for us, but having people who live with you 24/7, as these people did, who watched and were with you. You often took your son or your daughter with you, and so they were people who were witnesses, not just character witnesses, but they actually were witnessing your life. And if you're thinking back in the day when you didn't have kids or schools that kids were sent to, where are those kids? They're at home with mom and dad. They're witnessing what goes on every day. So you've got all of these witnesses who can testify to, what happened, that kind of thing.
Because my translation doesn't say opponents in court. Mine says contend with their enemies in the gate.
Right. Well, the gate is it's the city gate, and it's used as a court. Mine has a reference to as the court, which is why this one translates it that way. Deuteronomy 17:5. Do you have the same one? Deuteronomy 21:19, Deuteronomy 22:15-24, Isaiah 21:21,
Yeah.
and Amos 5:12. All of those are places where it talks about the judgment being made at the gate, which is why they call it the court. Just like a lot of other things happened at gates. I'm thinking back to, where did Luther get married? He got married at the church doors. He didn't go in church. He got married at the doors, at the gate. Yeah. Yeah, we forget sometimes that a lot of modern wedding practices have nothing to do either with biblical times or early Christian. Weddings in churches did not become a thing until after about the 1200s, and usually it was only the nobles who got married in church. And all of the traditions that we have at church come from that time. The white runner, the tux is a substitute for a military uniform. They wore their sidearm, which was a sword, usually on the opposite hand, so that's why That's how I remember what side the groom's side and what side's the bride's side. He's got to keep his sword hand free. You know, and so a lot of our traditions come out of that. But if you even in Luther's time in Germany, you usually got married it was public, but you didn't go in church. Church weddings were not a thing, and even in our own country, very often they weren't a thing. Again, back in Auroraville, I haven't looked at our books here ever, but because they would cover that same time. But especially in Auroraville, during the 20s, 30s, it would say at the parsonage.
Exactly.
So the bride and groom would come to the parsonage. The pastor of the congregation would have them exchange their vows there. They'd bring a couple of witnesses, or the pastor and his wife could be the witness. And but no, there was no party. There was no big procession and recession and all of the pomp and circumstance of our current weddings do not come out of a biblical. In Jesus' day and age, you would have been married. There was never a marriage in a synagogue or in the temple. Nobody got married there. You got married in your richest relative's house because they had the most room for the party. And the family made all the food. You would have a procession. The bride would dress up, swear, and process down the city street, but it would be down a street to get to the house where the vows were going to be exchanged. And scripture would be said, and prayers were made, but it was never done in a synagogue or a temple.
Just thinking about how children witness things that go on in the house and how that changes their idea of a process. When my mother was dying of ovarian cancer, and she was living in Madison, and every other day I was going on Badger bus, to take care of her.
Yeah.
And the doctor would start an IV, and I would tend it overnight, and so on. So, I mean, my kids, 8th grade, 5th grade, 3rd grade, were crying when I left. My mother and my stepfather were blinking back tears.
Tears when you left them?
I was always, feeling tears, and it was just so upset. And Gene had said, "Bring her here." I said, "How is that going to work in this household?" He said, "If God wills it, it will work." So he said, "Start see if you can get her support."
Sure.
So I found 2 doctors in the neighborhood that said, yes, they'd take care of her. And it just all fell in place. So she was with us for the last month of her life. And she was upstairs in Sarah's bed. Sarah bunked in our room, slept on a cot on the floor. And after my mother died, and it was probably 3-4 weeks, Sarah was back living in her room and everything. She shocked me one day when she said, "When I get old, I hope I die of cancer."
Huh.
Because she saw the grace with which my mother left this world,
Mm-hmm.
and how she was surrounded by love, and the fact that all of that coming and going, and tears and stress just stopped when she came. It was just such a blessing. Everybody you loved was under one roof, and it went just fine. And so, I should remind her of that. But probably doesn't have the same idea now,
Yeah.
but it was amazing.
Well, and that's one of the blessings, I think, of having a strong faith in God's love and grace for you, is that you not only live differently, but you die differently.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember one of the Milk Boys said that to me after Lester passed away. He had these guys all know who Lester is. Lester was one of our elders when I was here the first time, and he, in his 50s, I think he was in his early 50s, was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. Lived about a year and a half, which was pretty typical. then for pancreatic cancer. And I remember one of the boys after the funeral said, you know, Dad taught us how to live, but he also taught us how to die. Because Lester was real good about making sure that all the loose ends were all tied up. He had individual conversations with each of his boys. He had planned his funeral. He gave me something to read at the funeral to the boys. I mean, he had it all set up. Even though he was in pain, I know he endorsed it a number of trips and that kind of thing during that time while he was dealing with the cancer, because he said, we're going to make the most of this time that we have together. And that was the boy's observation. That kind of reminds me of what he said to Sarah. It's just, you know, you can show them not only how to live, but how to transition to God's presence. Well, thinking of God's presence, let's read Revelation 21. And while you're doing that, I'm going to step out for a minute. So let's start. Revelation 21, 1-7, a picture of heaven. Then I saw
a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea. I saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride, beautifully dressed for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Look, God's dwelling place is now among the people, and he will dwell with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. There will be no more death, or mourning, or crying, or pain, for the old order of things has passed away. He who was seated on the throne said, I am making everything new. Then he said, Write this down, for these words are trustworthy and true. And he said to me, It is done. I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. To the thirsty I will give water without cost from the spring of the water of life. Those who are victorious will inherit all this, and I will be their God, and they will be my children.
just got there in my Bible. I'd like you to turn there in your Bibles as well. Just thinking about this passage a little bit, it's a wonderful picture of heaven. And maybe to think a little bit about it, what's one of the most beautiful places you've ever been and what impressed you?
I think the mountains, and Dan and I were in Wenatchee National Forest at Holden Village. We are on the staff there, which is at the Lutheran camp.
Right, in Washington, state of Washington?
State, and we met out there in Warsaw, right? Okay, so we were there for 8 weeks on staff. And so we were able to take time to hike into the mountains and be really on top of them, because we were already up pretty high within that valley, and then we went up again and to look over all the mountains. And even while we were walking there, the streams were so clear, and you just put your face in them to get water. And then there was the glacier-fed lakes and everything, and all the flowers and everything. And to me, that was absolutely incredible.
Who else has a favorite place that they've been to that they just say, wow?
I've been to a lot of beautiful places, but I think one of the ones that sticks most in my mind is the Grand Canyon.
Mm-hmm.
The colors of the rock formations and the shapes of the rocks.
And it's a pretty big ditch, isn't it?
And that was that's maybe one of the reasons why I remember it. The first time I was there, I was a kid. I must have been, I don't know, 7 or 8, I think, when our parents, we went on a
Sure,
trip.
yeah.
And I'm standing at the railing, looking over at the canyon, and these 2 people were standing next to my sister and I hear this lady say, "Oh, I don't know what the big deal is. It's just a big hole in the ground."
You're like,
I was
are
just
you
a
kidding?
kid. Are you kidding me? And I was just a kid.
Yeah. No, it place to be.
If you could pick a place, Sharon, what would it be?
Yeah, I don't know. You know, it's so many things. My sister lived in southeastern Ohio, and it's the foothills of the Appalachians. And there are a number of, it's Hocking County. There's a place called Ash Cave. There's Old Man's Cave, but Ash Cave is beautiful. And this isn't a cave you're going into. It's just kind of an arrangement, and little waterfalls and the vegetation and everything. And then there's Door County,
Oh, man.
you know, which is
For sure.
dear to my heart, which
Yeah.
meant so much just in being apart and the relaxation of it and so on. Lots of good stuff out there. What about you?
What about you, Christy? What's your?
Fiji.
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 We
Oh.
took a helicopter. You could see all the islands. It was amazing.
Wow.
Would be amazing.
Yeah, I don't think my wife would do that. I know, I see those pictures. It's just phenomenal. Just phenomenal.
To see it from the air was really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I just, we've been lots of places, so I've seen lots of things, and there are too many to count, both in Europe and Hawaii. Yeah.
Alaska is beautiful.
Alaska. Watching the glacier calve, you know, when we're sitting on our balcony on a ship and stuff like that, just stuff like that. You just incredible. And you know, the colors we were just on in the mountains of Vermont and New Hampshire. No, it's just taking a cruise in the Mediterranean and leaving Venice at night. That was really interesting, just beautiful. So, you know, there's just a lot of things to see, and one of the challenges that you have is when you come back, you know, what words can you use to express so that other people could experience kind of what you experience verbally, and that's where it gets tough.
I always told my students that, I said, visual is very important because it's very hard to describe. For instance, how would you describe the Grand Canyon, you know, without pictures? And even then, it's not the same as when you're standing on the ledge.
When you're standing on the ledge and looking
And you
over.
go, oh.
Or I think when I was here last time, if I remember right, Charlene, who we prayed for, I think Charlene and Mark were going to take a trip down into the Grand Canyon on the donkeys, and he.
Charlene did that.
Yep, and I remember it because Mark had said, yeah, I need to lose a few pounds because there's a weight restriction on. So he was working at losing the weight so that they could do that donkey ride down into the Grand Canyon. That's a whole other perspective, wouldn't it be?
Yeah.
You know. And the next question we just kind of already talked about. So much of John's information about heaven is found in the Old Testament. And so what are these images a reflection of? There's a lot of references to this new heaven and new earth. Also in the Old Testament. So if you've got a, oops, back there. If you've got a Bible that's got study notes on it, for instance, you see it in verse 1, then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. And that's reflected in a number of other places in Scripture. So if you go to 2 Peter 3:13, 2 Peter 3:13, oops, is one of those places where it talks about that promise. And here specifically he references the fact that there were some promises in the Old Testament related to this. So somebody want to read just verse 13 of 2 Peter 3?
But in keeping with his promise, we are looking forward to a new heaven and a new earth, the home of righteousness.
All right, and this one will take us back to Isaiah 65 and 66. So go back to the book of the prophet Isaiah. And of course, Isaiah is the one who gives us in a number of places of pictures of the Messianic age.
What chapter?
65. It's the last two chapters of the book of the prophet Isaiah. Oh, now what verse was I on there? Yeah, it's in verse 17.
For behold, I create new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come to mind.
Keep going and read that section.
But be glad and rejoice forever in that what I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem rejoicing, and her people a joy. I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people, and no more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping and the cry of distress. No more shall there be in it an infant that lives but a few days.
Yeah, well, that's far enough. What I was just getting to is that in verse 19 where it talks about no more weeping. So you see the same language that's reflected in the book of Revelation is found here. And in that new heaven and new earth, the sound of weeping and crying disappears. And then in chapter 66, it's in verse 22.
As the new heavens and the new earth that I make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so will your name and descendants endure.
And keep going, would you?
From one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, all mankind will come and bow down before me, says the Lord. And they will go out and look upon the dead bodies of those who rebelled against me. Their worm will not die, nor will their fire be quenched, and they will be loathsome to all mankind.
Oh, that's a sweet way to end a book, isn't it?
Yeah, really.
But what is he saying? He's saying that there's going to be eternal life, right? He says, from one new man to another and from one Sabbath to another, all mankind will come down and bow before me. So that kind of points to the judgment, and then the picture of hell, this picture that a fire that is never quenched or gone out. And if you know in the New Testament, this is called Gehenna, or the Valley of Henna, which was located southwest of Jerusalem, and it was kind of a dump. And if you've ever been to a regular old-fashioned dump, the fire never goes out.
Our county used to dump there was a dump out there. And we had to carry our garbage out there and throw it.
In my first congregation, the dump was in Poisippy, just to the north of us. And so, you'd have to take your garbage to the dump. There was no garbage truck to pick it up. And you burned what you could, had a burn barrel in the back. I'm sure that was good for the environment, right? And then you took the rest of the garbage to the dump. You bag it up and haul it to the dump. So the point that Peter is making is that this was promised ahead of time, that this new heavens and new earth was coming. Let's see, I was just going to look. So that's the promise. The promise that a new heaven and a new earth would come, and that new heaven and new earth would be transformative, especially because, as you see, there's no crying or weeping. And what else does Isaiah say about stuff like the lion will lie down with the lamb, right? And so that promise of those things going by the wayside. Who are the residents of the New Jerusalem, and what do they look like? Well, who are the residents? How are they described here? In Revelation, back in Revelation again now. Who are the residents of the New Jerusalem, this new heavens and new earth and New Jerusalem.
And souls of those who have been identified.
Yeah, the saints of God are there. So it's his people, his children. And of course, in a biblical sense, you'd think, yes, of the Old Testament people of God, but you'd think also of the new Israel, which is the New Testament church. So it's the Old Testament, New Testament church together. And then what do they look like? How does it describe the way they look? It's in verse 2.
21. I'm in the wrong book.
Yeah, chapter 21, verse
Beautifully
2.
dressed
So this picture of the church as the
bride.
bride of Christ. And she is beautifully addressed and she's adorned. And that adornment is seen in the Bible in two different ways. The bride's, so let me find that other reference to it. So we can think about the fact that she's wearing the robes of righteousness, because she has been dressed by her bridegroom who laid his life down, who washed. And you hear that in Revelation chapter 7, that other passage that's often used at funerals, where John's getting the tour around heaven, and he sees all these people in white robes, and he says, who are these and where did they come from? And he said, these are they who have come through the great tribulation. They have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. But in the same context, the robes can stand for something else. If you go back to chapter 19.
Yeah, fine linen.
Oh, did you find it?
Yeah, fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. And then in parentheses it says, fine linen stands for the righteous acts of the saints.
So the white is symbolic not only of the washing that Jesus has given them, but also of our own good works. It's our good works are a response to God's grace, and so those also adorn us. What's that old saying about only what's done for Christ is last? Somebody just quoted that to me the other day again. That's the way it ends. I can't remember the way it begins, but it's do your works. What survives the judgment?
What you've done, the fruits of your...
The fruits of your faith, what you've done out of love for God and love for your neighbor. Whatever those are, that's what survives. Everything else gets destroyed.
But isn't that that's one of those hard things to understand, because we're not supposed to do good works just to do good works. We're supposed to do them out of love.
Out of love for God.
Yeah, but
They naturally
I
flow.
understand what they're counting for me.
Well, they still count.
Somebody's tallying them up.
Yep.
Yep.
They still count. And this is, I don't know that, we don't have time to get down to that, go down that road right now, but it's the whole idea of the degrees of heaven.
Yeah, but that
Where Paul talks about that in the judgment, he said our works, some of them are like straw, some of them are like wood, some of them are like brick, some of them are like gold, and the fire will destroy. And what survives, you see, and what he says in that passage, now that one just, I hadn't thought about that before, but what he says in that passage is, even if everything gets destroyed, if you're standing on Christ, you're going to survive. But the fact is that our works do shine, and this is the way when I'm teaching, especially about Matthew 25, this is a word picture I use. That's the judgment, where the king comes and he says to those on his right, blessed are you who are blessed by my Father from the time of creation, he says, take your inheritance prepared for you before creation. Now, that it's an inheritance means you didn't earn it, right? Somebody else earned it for you. But that's where he says, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was in jail and you came and visited me. I was sick and you know, all of those kind of things. And they say, well, why did we do this? And he says, when you've done it for one of the least of these brothers of mine, you've done it for me. Then he turns to the ones on the left and he says, depart from me, you who are cursed, into the fire prepared for the devil and his angels. That tells us, first of all, that hell was not prepared for people, it was prepared for Satan. Are people going there? Yes, because when somebody walks away from God, God doesn't force them into his kingdom. Or I like the way C.S. Lewis said it. He said, at the end of your life, either you're going to stand before God and say, God, have it your way, and he wants all people to be saved and come to the knowledge of the truth and to trust him. Or God is going to say to us, have it your way. You didn't want to have anything to do with me in life. You're not going to have anything to do with me in death. But the image I like is this. Imagine that somebody is walking around with a video camera and they're taping everything you've ever said, everything you've ever done. What's more, this is a special camera that can record every thought you've ever had.
I don't like this camera.
I don't like this camera. Now, the God who is all-knowing, he knows already what your thoughts and your actions and your words have been, right? And now imagine that on the last day, everybody's gathered together in this huge theater that includes all the souls that have ever lived in. And everybody's life gets displayed. That what's on that video gets displayed on the big screen for everybody to see. Well, I don't know about you, but it made me really nervous, right? But what's happened for the believer is that the only thing that shines through in that film are things that you've done out of love for God and love for your neighbor. If you can imagine every other one of those screenshots, the little pieces of film where you didn't love God and you didn't love your neighbor, what you're going to see is a red cross on a white background. Because Jesus blots out all your sins. How much of your film would be a white background with a red cross on it? And so the only thing that shines through on the day of judgment is the things you've done out of love for God and love for your neighbor. Not to earn your way into heaven, but as to say, yeah, I really trusted God and I lived in his grace and I strove to do the kind of things that he called me to do as his disciple, as a follower, in response to his grace, not to earn his grace. But you see, for somebody who didn't trust Jesus, there's no editing.
The other thing I think I understand is that you won't know that you're at this level and someone else is at this level, or that you're at this level, but that you would be happy that everybody's even there.
Right, if sin's not there, then you're not jealous
You're not jealous, and so
of what somebody else has.
It's just an acknowledgement,
Right.
but it's not who can best the other by good works.
Right,
That's
right.
not
That's not a part of it.
And that's very satisfying too, because it's not like you're in your
Competition. Yeah, there's no competition.
No competition.
So,
It's you and God, that's it.
So while I always like to remind us too, and maybe I'll just leave on that note, that just because it says there's no tears or mourning or crying or pain, then doesn't mean that there shouldn't be now. There's only 2 times in the Bible that Jesus cried. Once was over the city of Jerusalem because they wouldn't follow him. It broke his heart. And the other time was at the grave of his good friend Lazarus in John chapter 11, even though he knew he was going to raise him from the dead. Now think about that. It says, when he saw those who were gathered there, he wept. So I would say there's nothing wrong with weeping at this side of heaven. But behind our tears, my word picture for that is take off in a plane in the rain And sooner or later you get above the clouds and you know the sun's still shining. And for children of God who trust in Jesus, His love, His grace, His forgiveness, and His life, we know that He still shines. And so behind our tears is always that truth that He lives. And we're going to live someday too. Let's close with prayer. Lord God, Heavenly Father, we thank and praise You for the comfort and the strength You give to us to deal with death as we build our lives with You as our construction manager, as You help us to rest in Your grace, Your love, Your work on our behalf through Your Son, our Savior, Jesus. And we ask that You would especially, as we celebrate another All Saints Day, we ask especially that You would bring us comfort in the middle of our tears. When those waves of grief hit us, that always behind those waves is the truth, the solid truth, the anchor behind those waves of Your grace and love for our loved ones and for us. Bless us as we continue to work through grief this side of heaven until that day we come to the new heaven and new earth, the new Jerusalem that You are creating for Your children. We ask it in Your Son's name. Amen.
You gotta really get people coming back.